Hey everyone, my name is Amar Galani and I'll be your instructor for today. And today we're going to be talking about applying dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, in social work practice. So this session will take around 30-40 minutes, and it's intended to be part of the Social Work 8610 Advanced Practice in Social Work course. However, it can be used for any purpose. And the idea here today is to apply DBT in social work practice, and to go beyond just the skills and to learn how to apply or to understand how people have applied DBT in community mental health practices, as well as in specific borderline personality disorder clinics. And so I'll be going through a slideshow for today. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me at agalani, AGHELANI, at uwindsor.ca. So let's get into it. Okay, and I just apologize in advance. My daughter is going down for her nap right now, so she's not fully asleep, so if I have to pause really quickly to go talk to her, then I will do that, or if she needs her diaper changed or whatever, I just have her in the corner here. But hopefully it doesn't, she doesn't get too disrupted. So anyway, today I'll be speaking from two texts that I've used as a dialectical behavior therapy practitioner. First one is the main text, Cognitive Behavior Therapy in the Treatment of Borderline Personality Disorders. This is one of the first, or this is the first DBT textbook. It's huge, it's really dense, it's really hard to get through unless you are working in a specific borderline personality disorder clinic. We're using like the model of DBT as your only model. I wouldn't recommend going through this book. It's really heavy. However, there is a protocol for everything. There is a very specific way to apply DBT, and this book outlines it in clear detail. It has been updated. There's countless different versions that kind of boil down the ideas and theories to make it more applicable in different settings. And so I'd highly encourage you to look out for those other interpretations. And also a book that is highly valuable in any clinical practice is the DBT Skills Training Manual. Again, there's a lot of very useful protocols. All the skills are in here. There's a lot of things in here that can show you how to run a DBT group and how to apply the skills with people who are struggling with suicidal thoughts or self-harm or self-destructive kind of behaviors. So for those of you who don't know, I should have gone over this in class, but just really quickly, I have worked as a DBT clinician. I worked with the Canadian Mental Health Association's Borderline Personality Disorder Clinic. I've also been a social worker using DBT skills in diverse settings for at least 7-8 years. And so I have a private psychotherapy practice, and I've found that even after I left my time at CMHA, I found the skills and the knowledge I've learned through the DBT program there to be extremely useful. I did a lot of training around DBT with professionals, psychologists, online training that really helped me conceptualize and understand how to use DBT in clinical practice to make it useful to the people that I'm working with. And it's important to recognize that this presentation will not be going through the skills in a lot of detail, because a lot of trainings do that. The skills are often self-explanatory. What the purpose of this presentation is to take your DBT practice to the next level, and especially to apply it with people who are struggling with suicidal ideation and with self-harm and very self-destructive behaviors, to assess and intervene those situations, and to provide people options for hope and ways to cope with those intense feelings that and those situations that can lead to self-harm risk. So first, let me talk a bit about traditional DBT programs and BPD clinics. This is typically the environments where DBT was conceptualized to be applied. The initial program itself was evidence-based to work in these settings, and they're very structured, very specific environments. So They're designed for clients with who've been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and/or have a history of numerous suicide attempts or persistent self-harm that's not responding to traditional cognitive behavior therapy. It's a highly structured program with a long assessment, orientation, and commitment phase. So people have really got to want this therapy, and I'll tell you why. It, Traditionally, it starts off with a 4-session assessment. So this assessment is summarized into a report that's presented to the DBT team, and the team eventually decides if the client is appropriate to be placed on the wait list. So this assessment involves standardized questionnaires, the BSL, the LRAMP, a variety of like written questionnaires that the client writes out on their own, as well as interview questionnaires that's done with the therapist. And after 4 sessions of assessment, the therapist will, like I said, put the assessment into a report. During the weekly consultation meetings, the therapist will present the report to the team, and then the team will decide if it makes sense to move forward with this client or if there's other services that might be more appropriate for this client. So after the presentation, if the team decides, okay, this is a client that's appropriate for DBT, and again, clients appropriate for DBT are typically people who've had at least 2 suicide attempts, who have ongoing severe destructive self-harm behaviors, or who've been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, or who meet all the criteria as based on the assessment. The next step is an orientation, where all the clients who've gone through an assessment will meet together for a group orientation where 2 therapists will review the structure, the focus, the commitments, the process, and the goals of DBT therapy. It's an opportunity to ask questions and for clients to really understand what they're getting themselves into. And then at that point, once the orientation is done, no one is in DBT yet. They're given 1 week to think about it. A lot of people might be jumping to get into DBT, but it's important for them to process what the commitments are, to think about it, and then it's their responsibility to call the therapist back and confirm that they are still interested. At this point, they'll either be put on a wait list or the therapy will start, depending on the demands of the agency. And the therapy begins with some commitments. So there's 3 or 4 sessions where the therapist will meet with the client and really review again with them what's required. We'll get an idea of what their goals are, develop a crisis and safety plan, and then we'll provide them a binder of skills and discuss what DBT will require of them, as well as what they need from the therapist and DBT. After the client has signed the orientation and the commitment package, the therapy begins and they're provided their first diary cards. So it's quite a process to start the therapy, and then the therapy is a year long. And I'll tell you what the therapy will involve. But first, they have to make some commitments. Also, before I get into commitments, I should have discussed this in the lecture earlier, but the therapy involves 1 year of weekly 1-hour long one-to-one therapy sessions with a DBT trained therapist. Every week, they've got to do a skills training group, which they have to attend every single week for 2 hours. And there's 2 rounds of that group that happens over the year. They have to do a diary card as their homework. They have to do the skills training homework, and they have to reach out for skills consultation or skills training if they're finding it difficult to use the skills in their everyday life. And that skills training is typically provided 24 hours a day by that therapist. However, in some settings, it's less feasible. So the therapist will encourage them to call a crisis line that's DBT informed, or we'll have separate hours. So when I worked at CMHA, I provided hours between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m., where if a client was in crisis, they would call me and I'd provide skills coaching. And the protocols around that skills coaching are very specific as well. Usually the call will not last for more than 15 or 20 minutes, and the client will know exactly what I'm going to be doing. I'll be encouraging them to use skills and guiding them through the skills application process. So in terms of commitments, at the very minimum, a DBT client has to agree to work towards eliminating life-threatening behaviors and build a more worthwhile life. So they have to also address if they experience barriers to working in therapy, if they're avoiding or refusing to talk about their feelings or events connected to the suicidality, if they're not accepting input. They have to make commitments to stop these kinds of behaviors, because we can't work we can't help someone who's dead. That's a core of DBT, is that the number one priority in DBT is to eliminate self-destructive, life-threatening behaviors and the behaviors that contribute to that. And therapy interfering behaviors are part of that. Level 2 is a commitment to collaborate with a therapist in specific treatment procedures, such as learning new skills, implementing those skills in problem situations. And then level 3 is a commitment to implement whatever behavior solutions that the therapist and the client agree towards during the solution analyses of the sessions. So in a typical session, once the therapy is started, client will come in and we'll start off developing an agenda. So take maybe 3 to 5 minutes, where we'd start with reviewing their diary card. So I'd immediately ask them, okay, can I see your diary card? We go through their diary card, look at if there's any life-threatening or suicidal behaviors or thoughts. We'd go over their homework, their behavioral assignments. We would use their identify their target hierarchy of behavioral analyses, and I'd ask them as well what they want to talk about today. What they want to talk about today comes after reviewing the diary card. It comes after reviewing the homework. This is a very directive therapy where the therapist is leading the show, and the client knows that there are specific things that are required of them. So number one, the diary card. If it's not done, we're going to be asking why. What got in the way? What can help you do it daily? Do you need cell phone reminders? If you're having a hard time, ask them to call me. And we'd review commitments that doing diary cards are an essential component of this therapy, so they need to do them. Second is a chain analysis or a behavior analysis, where we'd identify targets that, whatever is getting in the way of stopping those suicidal thoughts or suicidal behaviors or cutting. We would kind of find out what are the contributing factors to understand that's leading up to that. And then we develop a solution analysis where we'd problem solve, we'd review commitments, we'd introduce skills, and we'd look at what are things that can help this person stop the cutting or stop the disordered eating or the suicidal thoughts. And then we'd have a wind down where we'd gain their thoughts, we'd talk about what they want to talk about, we would review their relational issues, discuss the homework, and then we'd assign new homework for the next week. So this is very much like how a DBT session would work in this traditional therapy. Here's a sample of a diary card. So as you can see, every single day, they are identifying how suicidal they feel, their thoughts and urges to die, thoughts and urges to self-harm, thoughts and urges to use drugs or alcohol, the intensity of their emotions, all on a scale of 1 to 5, and then the actions. Did they have any problems with sleep? Did they attempt suicide? Did they take steps towards attempting suicide? Did they avoid people? Whatever their target behaviors are, this is developed during the commitments phase. That's what's focused on. So if their sleep problems are contributing to the suicidal ideation, then we would look at sleep as something that we have to monitor closely through the therapy. We'd also monitor the skills that are used. So on the backside, what they're doing is they're circling every skill that they use throughout the day. And we want to see this page filled up as much as possible, right? So everything that they've done. Sometimes it can be DBT related, from like using a mastery skill or radical acceptance. Sometimes it can be their own ideas. So walking the dog or caring for pets for this client has been a way to cope. So that's part of their coping, right? So in terms of the target behaviors, the most important thing that we need to target in DBT is their suicidal behaviors. So these are the things that are life-threatening. Are they doing things like walking by a bridge and looking down? Are they doing things like collecting knives? Are they doing things like, eating poisonous substances? These are things that need to be identified. How often are they doing this? How close are they to ending their lives? Are they taking small steps towards suicide, such as drinking and then looking down on their balcony? Are they having suicidal expectations or thoughts or emotional responses? All this we need to really focus on every session until these thoughts, urges, behaviors start to reduce. And so that's targeted on the diary card. So when someone gives me their diary card, the first thing I'm looking at are these target suicidal behaviors. Next, we would target the therapy interfering behaviors. So things like not coming to sessions, not doing the homework, coming in late, becoming willful, believing that they don't need to do the homework anymore. if they're not making progress in the therapy, if there's behaviors that are functionally related to the suicidal behavior. So for example, you know, using cannabis really heavily or drinking really heavily or regularly, not eating or sleeping, these could be considered therapy interfering behaviors, because if they come into session and let's say they haven't eaten very well in a few days, or they've been binging and purging a lot, or engaging in behaviors that, like if they're getting very angry at the therapist regularly, these would be therapy interfering behaviors because they're continuing the suicidal ideation and they're getting in the way of making treatment progress. Then after that, we'd focus on quality of life interfering behaviors. So that can include conflicts with family, it can include problems at work, problems at school, anything that's getting in the way of them living the lives that they want to live. We would focus on that after the suicidal behaviors and the therapy interfering behaviors, and then we would get into increasing their behavioral skills. So how can they be more skillful in dealing with the life problems that they have? So not everyone works in a DBT setting. Actually, very few people work in a DBT setting. That's just a DBT clinic for people with BPD. DBT is typically adapted to work in a variety of settings. And so this is because full DBT programs are expensive. They're not feasible for most community organizations. And a lot of clients don't want to do it, right? Like it's a lot of commitment to do a diary card every day. It's a huge commitment. A lot of clients might not need it. And however, the skills, the strategies, and the techniques are extremely useful for a variety of problems in counseling and case management settings. And so even though it was originally developed for people with borderline personality disorder, it's also considered a very good therapeutic practice for clients with a range of issues. And that's how I found it as well too. And even when I wasn't working in the BPD clinic, I found this, the skills, strategies, protocols to be quite useful. So let's talk about those strategies. These are the strategies you're not going to hear about as much. A lot of the times, things like the mindfulness skills, emotional regulation, especially distress tolerance or interpersonal effectiveness skills get a lot of attention. And we should have discussed that in class earlier today. However, these strategies are vital to DBT and really useful in a variety of places, right? So first, it's the crisis strategies. So if a client comes to us in crisis, which they do in lots of different types of settings, we need to know how to respond to that. And DBT has a very specific way to do that. First, rather than focusing on what the problem is, the content of their issue, we need to attend to their emotion. Because their emotions are at like 9 out of 10, we're not going to be able to problem solve effectively with them because they're too intense. They might be crying, they might be very angry, they might be quite anxious. And so we explore the problem. We don't ignore the content of the problem, but we focus on the immediate time frame. What can we get done in a short time to help resolve this crisis or to reduce the intensity of the crisis? What emotions are going on there for them? Then we identify key prompting events for the current emotions. So what happened? Was it that they had a conflict with their partner? Was it that their pet died? Was it that they were threatened by their landlord to lose their housing? Once we formulate an idea of the problem, a summary of the problem, what contributed to it, what started it, what are the emotions, we can help them reduce the intensity of their emotions of it and then move on with problem solving. So we can give advice, make suggestions, frame possible solutions, predict future consequences. So essentially, like if you do A, yell at your landlord for threatening to kick you out, what's likely to happen after that? If you write him a letter, what would you say in that letter? What's likely to happen after that? If you apologize for getting a little bit angry with him, what's likely to happen after that? So we list out a variety of options. We identify factors interfering with productive plans of actions. For example, anger could really get in the way of a productive course of action. And then we focus on distress tolerance. How can we reduce that anger? How can we reduce that anxiety so the client can actually follow through on their crisis plan and then anticipate that this might happen again. And so what are we going to do next time? We're going to be prepared for those triggers. We're going to be prepared that if a relationship conflict happens, we need to apply some distress tolerance skills. We're going to use these problem solving skills. It's going to be resolved in essentially the same way. And so letting them know this is how we're going to deal with crises gives them a sense of consistency. It gives them a sense of predictability. They know what to expect from us. They know what not to expect from us. And ideally, they might start to remember some of these things themselves so that they don't end up in crisis over and over again. They can start using the crisis strategies on their own. Suicidal ideation is also something that DBT is tailored to address. And this is why. There is a step-by-step way of effectively dealing with suicidal ideation that's based in a lot of evidence. So first step, assessing the risk for suicide. How likely are they to act on the suicidal ideation? How likely are they to seriously harm themselves? We look at their known factors related to immediate suicidal behavior to predict imminent risks. So the factors can be, have they attempted suicide before? Do they have coping skills? Do they have supports? Do they have people they can reach out to? Are they likely to reach out to those supports? Do they have the means to end their life? Do they own a gun? Do they have a knife collection? What's the lethality? Like, are they scratching themselves with their nails really hard, or are they like preparing to jump off a bridge? It's always important to consult with our management, emergency services, medical consultant. If we have access to a psychiatrist on the team, a physician, it's good to consult with them. We don't want to be the only one dealing with this situation. And then we follow a crisis plan that's already been prepared. If we're working with someone in case management or counseling, and we know that there's a history of suicidal ideation, we want to have a crisis plan done early on and then revert back to that in these kinds of situations. And ideally it's on paper and we can bring it up to them and say, okay, let's go back to the crisis plan. Sometimes we might not think about it, but it's really important to tell the person not to kill themselves, that this is a bad idea and that we don't support that, and that they should not harm themselves in any way, that we don't think that's a effective way to solve their problem. And then generating hopeful statements and solutions. So like, you can get through this. It's a temporary problem. You've had problems before, you've gotten through it, you'll be able to get through it again. Let's look at some solutions to cope. And then we keep in contact with the client when their suicide risk is high. So in case management, calling them a little bit more often, having people check in on them, having their family check in on them if possible, and anticipate that they might become suicidal again. If their depression's gone down, it might come back in a few days. So what are we going to do in that case? Do they have a copy of their safety plan? Do they have someone that's checking in on them? And then we communicate the client's risk to their emergency contact if there is consent from the client or if there is imminent risk. A core component of DBT is the behavior chain analysis and the solution chain analysis. And so I should have discussed this in class earlier. I'm not going to get into this too much, but the key thing I want to get across is that this tool is highly effective to understanding problem behaviors and to ending or eliminating problem behaviors. It's a primary skill for addressing suicidal risk or self-harm behaviors. Someone comes up to me and says, oh, I had a suicide attempt over the weekend. I'm definitely going to be doing a behavior chain analysis of like, what led to that? What triggered it? What were the thoughts, the feelings, the situation? What was going through your mind? What was going on in your body? What predisposed you to this? Did you not sleep well? Did you miss medication? Did you have a conflict? It's highly valuable in addictions treatment, in any kind of problem behaviors, whether it's restricting, binging, purging, panic attacks. Some people might be over shopping, engaging in addictive behaviors, anger outbursts. We can use this chain analysis for any of these kinds of problems. Contingency management is another component of DBT that's integrated through almost every aspect of the change components of DBT. And what contingency management is really, at its core, it's behavior therapy. So what we want to do is reinforce adaptive behaviors. We want to reward behaviors that we want to see. So if a client who's been having difficulty showing up to sessions on time shows up on time, we can't ignore that. We have to praise that behavior. If they haven't been completing their diary card and they one day bring it in fully completed, yes, that's amazing, good work. I love to see that. You're making such good progress. This is a really important step forward. Give them time for that. Make sure that praise is experienced as rewarding for them. So for some people, when they're praised, they might get a bit anxious. But for people who want to hear praise and validation, we need to give that to them when they make positive steps. And then gradually we'll phase out that reinforcement. So if they're starting to do their behavior cards or their diary cards every day, or if they're starting to show up regularly every session at the right time, then we don't need to praise them every time. We don't need to reinforce that behavior every time. We reinforce it at first, and then the next session we might say, hey, you showed up on time, good job. The next session, oh, good job, good to see you on time. And then after that, we don't need to mention it, right? So we gradually phase it out. Behavior therapy is also about extinguishing maladaptive or unhelpful behaviors. So we remove rewards that maintain unwanted behaviors. So for example, if a client comes to a session and says, oh yeah, I cut up my arm. Here, you wanna see? And then they show us a bunch of cuts on their arm. We can't show kindness and warmth at that time. We can't show too much concern. A client might have gotten a lot of reinforcement in their lives, an unintentional reinforcement or reinforcement nonetheless for maladaptive behaviors, whether it's drinking too much, cutting, unwanted, or like excessive behaviors of any kind. A core component of DBT is showing neutrality and sometimes a bit of coldness when a client demonstrates maladaptive behaviors. So if a client came into session and essentially said, oh yeah, I cut over the weekend, I would say, that's not good. We're trying to stop these kinds of behaviors. And so can I see your diary card? Is it reflected on your diary card? I would really not minimize it, but I would show some disappointment that like this is not a step towards therapeutic progress. And then I would engage in problem solving to help the client find other behaviors or skills that can be reinforced. So if the next session they come in and say, well, I cut less this week and I used the opposite action skill to do so, that's where I would reinforce and say, yes, amazing. It's not good that you cut, but it's very good that you use that skill to cut less. So it's moving steps forwards, right? Sometimes we provide aversive contingencies for high priority maladaptive behaviors. So for example, like if a client's been showing like missing a lot of sessions, we have to let them know that we disapprove of that. They've made a number of commitments and we have to show our disappointment as a way of the client knowing where we stand. So this has to be done very cautiously. For some clients, as soon as we show some disapproval or withdrawal, they might just stop coming back to therapy, right? And so in the context of a caring, strong therapeutic relationship, if a client's been coming for months and then they just stop showing up regularly or they start missing a lot of sessions, that's when we can show some disapproval or a withdrawal of warmth. But it needs to be done within the context of a strong therapeutic connection already. So also there's the correction over correction. So when a problem behavior comes up, we withdraw the positive condition. We withhold something that the client wants. So let's say the client wants us to show concern. The client wants us to say, hey, look, I cut myself, can't you like feel bad for me, or can't you say something about that? Don't you care? First, we withdraw and maintain our neutrality, and then we require the client to engage in new behavior, which corrects the effects of the maladaptive behavior and overcorrects. So if they keep showing up late, we might need to give them extra homework to show them that we need to stop this behavior, because when they show up late, we don't get as much done in the session and they're less likely to make progress. And so the overcorrection can also be things like doing behavior chain analyses over and over again related to the problem behaviors, so they understand what's been contributing to the behaviors, and then using more skills so they have less time to talk about what they want to talk about, and more time has to be spent on the problem behavior, whether it's showing up late or cutting or whatever. We also use shaping. So that's using a reinforcement schedule to gradually and progressively shape the responses of the client, or shape the behavior of the client towards their goal-directed behavior. So that can, again, include things like praise. It can include things like rewards, like giving them more time to talk about things they want to talk about. So let's say they have some relationship problems they really want to discuss. If we notice that their suicidality is decreasing, if their substance use is decreasing, their target behaviors are less, they're thinking less about suicide, they're thinking less about life-threatening behaviors, then we shape their behavior by, first of all, acknowledging that they're making progress, and then saying, yes, now you have time to talk about what you want to talk about. Let's focus on that relationship. Let's focus on those areas that are important to you. And it's important not to push the client too far, right? DBT is a directive therapy, but there is always a balance between validation and acceptance of the client for who they are and the difficulties that they're experiencing, and a balance towards change, right? And we do need to push towards change, but we have to push them just below their limit of capability, because if we push them too hard, they're going to find the therapy too aversive and they're going to drop out. So we don't want them to drop out, because then we're not helpful to them, right? So we do want to push them, but not too much. And when we notice that, we're kind of going a little too fast, it's important to use validation strategies to strengthen that therapeutic relationship. Skills training is a central component of DBT, but how do we make it useful to our clients? The therapist needs to teach a variety of skilled responses to different situations. And not every skill is going to work for every person. Not every skill is going to work for every situation. But the more skills we offer for the variety of problems that they might be experiencing, the more we rehearse those skills in session, outside of session, when we give homework to practice those skills, that's when you're going to start to notice some more skillful behaviors, some therapeutic progress. And we need to be explicit and firm regarding the necessity of the client's regarding the necessity of the client to create an environment for themselves that reinforces their change. So for example, if they are surrounded by people who are cutting or using substances to cope with their feelings, we need to help the client develop an environment where they're getting some praise and some reinforcement for therapeutic change, for progress, for not using or not cutting. And part of that validation is using these validation strategies. These are highly effective. I use them all the time as an instructor, as a social worker, as a father, and as a husband. They've improved my life in numerous ways. And we do this stuff, right? Like as social workers, validation is something that we're good at. And the more intentional we are about validation, the more aware we are of our validation skills, the better we get at it, and the more we can apply it in the right time, in the right way. So let me give you an example. The first step in validation is just showing interest, right? We need to show the client that we're paying attention to them through verbal and nonverbal communication, just nodding, looking at them, eye contact. Next step, using reflection of thoughts. So things like, oh wow, of course you felt angry. If your partner is not paying attention to you, or if your partner showed up late for a date, of course you'd be angry about that. Yeah. Then the next step is mind reading the person's behavior. So, so were they like, did you tell the client, or did you tell your partner to show up at 6 o'clock for dinner? Yeah. And wow, it must be really annoying to have to be waiting there by yourself. And, there was no problems with traffic or anything. And, you were able to get there on time. So they should have been able to get there on time, right? So that's part of the validation. Mind reading, like, wow, that must have been so annoying. That must have been so disappointing, especially considering a lot of people have disappointed you in the past. So for example, let's say a client has had their parents separate or divorce, and then their partner is starting to not attend appointments on time, or attend dates on time. We could say something like, I can see why you'd do that. I can see why you'd feel that way. I can see why you'd be so frustrated, since this reminds you of how your father treated you. And then communicating the client's behavior and emotions makes sense. So yeah, of course, I could see why you'd be angry if they didn't show up on time. I can see why you might have yelled at them, or why you sent that text to them afterwards, and communicating that their behavior is reasonable. We do that when their behavior is reasonable. So if the client decided to, let's say, cut their partner's tires because they didn't show up to a date on time, we might not use that level of validation, right? We have to match the level of validation to the situation that's happening. And the highest level of validation is essentially treating the client like we would want to be treated in that situation. So we use self-disclosure and say, wow, if my partner showed up that late, showed up an hour late to a date, it was our anniversary, I would feel just as angry as you did. I would do the same thing. I would send an angry text as well too. So now using DBT in case management, a lot of us work in case management settings, and DBT has been blended with community case management to help clients meet their immediate needs and to help them stabilize. So in these situations, clients are not often consenting to engage in psychotherapy. Sometimes the therapist or the case manager might not have psychotherapy skills, um, and psychotherapy might not be appropriate for the client. Let's say if it's in a housing setting and they're looking to um, find a place to live, then psychotherapy might not be what they're looking for. They're looking for a place to live. However, the skills and strategies can still be helpful. The skilled materials can be provided in between meetings. It can be helpful in addressing crises, and the strategies can be used by the clinician to address lots of common challenges. So one of the first things that's really valuable in DBT that I found is the 5 options for solving any problem. So that can include fixing the problem solving. 2, changing the perspective on the problem, so changing how we think about the situation. We can make the problem worse by getting angry or getting drunk or high or doing like cutting. We can accept the problem and do nothing. That, okay, this is a problem, but we don't need to do anything. Or we can refuse to accept and stay miserable. So those are the options, right? And there's very much a change and acceptance dialectic that's involved in these options. And we can go through these with our clients and help them figure out, what do they want to do here? What do they think makes sense? Some of the dialectical strategies that DBT therapists and case managers and people in all different types of mental health settings use are things like weighing out the balance between the meanings of their behavior. So if a client comes to a session and says, look, I just want to die, that has 2 meanings. Like, one might be that they have unbearable pain and they don't feel like their life is worth living. But at the same time, if their life was really not worth living and they really wanted to die, they might not have told us. They might have tried to end their lives on their own. They're telling us for a reason. And so the other meaning in that statement, if I want to die, could be that they want help from with whom they're speaking with. And so you can see that there's a tension there between their feelings of want to die and also their feelings of wanting help so they don't actually die. Using metaphors is also a way to connect with clients, develop deeper relationships. So for example, if a client is wondering, like, why can't I just drive out there and drive them to a detox center, right? They're calling me in crisis and saying, hey, I need to go to detox. I'm feeling like getting drunk. Come pick me up. I need you to drive me. We could say something like, look, if someone was falling deep into water, I might not jump in after them because we both might drown. I'd rather throw them a life preserver and teach them to swim rather than to jump in after them. And so right now, rather than me driving out to drive you to detox, I'm going to suggest that you call someone in your AA network. I would suggest you take a bus. I would suggest you try these different strategies and use some coping skills to reduce the intensity of your feelings so you don't end up relapsing, right? That's one of the ways of using a metaphor. There's lots of different metaphors out there. And I think that, we kind of develop our own strategies for what works. We can also play devil's advocate. So a client can say like something like, yeah, I really don't feel like this therapy is working. And again, this is with someone that you know very well, and they can say something like, yeah, I don't think this is worth it. You can say something like, yeah, like maybe it's not worth it. Maybe the life you were living before you started therapy was better than this. That's a way of kind of being a bit facetious and pushing them a little bit. So you don't want them to think that you're being real, right? It's a bit sarcastic, but the idea there is to provoke them just a little bit so they can see the folly of their way of thinking. And again, having a good therapeutic relationship is really important when using devil's advocate. We can also use something like extending. So let's say the client says that they want to kill themselves, and the client is often making suicidal statements like, I missed the bus today. I wish I could just jump in front of traffic and kill myself. You could take them very seriously and say, wow, you want to kill yourself? How would you do it? Are you going to jump in traffic after this appointment? Maybe we need to talk about going to the hospital. If you're really serious about dying, the client might then say, oh, actually, I'm not actually going to kill myself. And that's when you can have a conversation about making suicide statements and how that affects other people. And what do they get out of making those suicide statements? We can help them activate wise mind and helping them look on the bright side, allowing for natural change. These are all things that social workers do as well. That are it's common in our repertoire. I'm not going to talk about radical acceptance because we should have discussed this in the lecture, but this is another really common skill to help people reduce the intensity of frustration with situations that they simply cannot change. And distress tolerance. So again, very common skills to help people tolerate their emotions in situations that they can't change or that they don't need to change. Using opposite action is something that they can actively do when they know that their feelings do not fit the facts of the situation. So, for example, let's say their partner showed up late to a date um, and they feel like cutting their tires, they feel like blowing up at them. Using opposite action would be doing the opposite. So maybe the opposite of cutting their tires would be like talking about their feelings. Maybe it could be telling them, "Hey, I missed you a lot. Like, why didn't you show up?" Asking them what happened. That would be the opposite of cutting their tires. So, of course, this all sounds way easier than it's actually done, right? And there are roadblocks. There are challenges in DBT and challenges in case management, in all kinds of mental health work. People are complex and people hit roadblocks. So, for example, let's say the client is coming in late or they're not attending sessions. We would reorient them to the purpose of the therapy, right? To the procedures of how things are going to work. We would use a chain analysis to understand what got in the way of coming. We would explain the consequences of lateness or non-attendance, that their needs are not getting met, right? Like I can only help you if you come in for sessions or if you come in on time, or we set aside an hour today. Um, we would not extend the session if they showed up 30 minutes late. We wouldn't give them an extra 30 minutes because that reinforces the problem behavior. What we would do is end the session on time and explain that this is a consequence of being late, that you're losing time here. We would review the commitments that they made at the beginning of the therapy or the beginning of the case management, and we would validate the behaviors. That, oh man, I hate when the bus shows up late. Like that happens to me. That happens to me all the time. Like, oh, when the subways get delayed, yeah, that's really frustrating. So we don't reinforce the behavior, but we validate the feelings that came up as related to their situation. We would praise any steps towards arriving on time or towards coming into session. Heap on the praise early on, and then gradually withdraw that praise once they start showing up regularly. So that's how we shape their behavior. Let's say the client doesn't want to do the work. In case management, this is kind of hard because we might not be assigning homework, but in therapy, they should be doing homework, right? They need to do work in between sessions in order to make therapeutic progress. And let's say the client doesn't want to do it, we would identify that they might be being a little willful. So they come in, they haven't done the work, and they might say, "Oh, I didn't have time." So I would say, okay, let's count how many hours there are in the week. 24, like you're awake at least 12 hours a day. Um, you know, 12 hours times 5, that's 60 hours during the work week. So during 60 hours, you didn't have time to do 5 minutes of homework. Really? Or is it that you don't have time or that you didn't want to? And so then we would say something like, yes, it is hard to do the homework. It's emotionally draining and there's a lot of value to it. And that's where we can also use dialectical strategies, such as, on the one hand, you want this therapy to work, you want to stop smoking crack and being suicidal. And on the other hand, you don't want to do the work that is required to prevent relapse and stop the suicidal thoughts. That's really interesting. We could use metaphors, so such as, like, rather than doing the work for you, rather than giving you a meal, I'm teaching you how to cook, right? Um, or something like devil's advocate, like, yeah, forget doing the homework. Yeah, like, homework sucks. I don't want to review the homework either. Let's just both give up. Let's just, not do this anymore and like talk about sports for the session. How about that? Again, every therapist is different. It is really based on your skills, your style, what kind of strategies that you're going to use in that session. And of course, we have to use a chain analysis and cognitive strategies for understanding, like, what are the thoughts behind not wanting to do the work? What are the behaviors, the situations that are contributing, so that we can help them create more skillful responses and solutions to their problems. And we can also try something like Like if you don't do the homework, then you're not going to get the full benefit of the therapy. Let's try opposite action skill. Let's try other skills that can help you get there. Let's say the client is just crying too much. They're just too emotional or they're too angry. Validating their emotions and then using some distress tolerance or mindfulness skills can be really valuable to reducing the intensity of the emotion and then helping them extinguish that unhelpful behavior. So, of course, crying in session is natural, right? Like it's okay. It's a stress reliever. There's some value to crying. However, I've had clients that would use up half my tissue box and fill my garbage full of tissues and cry through maybe 20 to 30 minutes of the session, 20 to 30 minutes straight of just crying and sobbing and like not being able to discuss their issues. That's going to be a problem because if they do that every session, they're not going to notice the change that they want to notice. They're not going to have a chance to rehearse the skills with me. They can cry without me being there. What is it about me being in the session in front of them that brings up the intensity of this emotion, whether it's anger, anxiety, distress? And then we can redirect towards their goals. Like, I know you want to improve your relationship with your partner. I know you want to stop being suicidal. I know you want to get back to work. So, how is this crying helping you get there? It isn't. So we need to work on the level of your sadness right now, bring it down a bit so that you can get done what you need to get done. We reorient them to the work that we're doing. We remind them of their commitments, and then we try some opposite action skills. So instead of crying, what would be the opposite of crying right now? Let's say the client is becoming willful, disruptive, or oppositional in sessions. Well, we need to identify that. We need to recognize, like, hey, you're being really angry right now, and I see you're showing some willfulness, some barriers to your progress here. Of course, your situation is very frustrating. However, I can't just back off because you're in a bad mood today. We need to do this therapy. We need to go through the diary card. We need to do the chain analysis. Maybe first let's use some distress tolerance skills and then get back to the work we need to do. We need to offer them some choices. So like we could do the diary card at the beginning of the session or maybe halfway through the session. We could do a chain analysis right now, or maybe let's do the improved skill or the tip skill first. We could suggest mindfulness or opposite action, modeling calmness. And that's a really important part of this therapy, is showing them that even though they might feel out of control, they might feel very angry, we can be a beacon of calmness for them so that they can pick up on that vibration and hopefully reflect it back to us as well. So that was the taking DBT to the next level in your therapeutic practice. It's a really short form. I know I speak really fast. We went through a lot of stuff. If you have questions, please contact me. This is my Laurier email. I'll also have my Windsor email, which is aghelani@uwindsor.ca. So if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. My hope is that this presentation today will help you take your DBT practice to a place where it can be more effective and more helpful for the clients that you're serving, so that we can help people get to be where they want to be. So thank you very much for your time today, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you.